Hi everybody, this is our third lesson on the League of Nations. Please make sure that if you haven't done lessons 1 and 2, you go back and do those first. Lesson 1 was on knowledge and lesson 2 was on how to answer question 3, the write an account questions. So today we're going to have a closer look at the 16 mark questions. These are the highest tariff, the highest value questions. They also have 4 marks available for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So it's really, really important that we get these ones right. Pay close attention, make sure you've got a pen and a piece of paper handy. There's going to be lots to note down today. We already have quite a lot of experience with this question, particularly recently, of course, with the health ones. These 16 mark questions, they're a statement about something and how far do you agree with it. So it's an evaluating, it's giving lots of knowledge, but making sure you are weighing up how far something agrees with the statement. So this is a 4-paragraph answer. It's the most detailed, the most in-depth question that we do in GCSE history. So in the first paragraph, you always address the event, the thing that is mentioned in the statement. So that's the thing you talk about. So if the question is saying something like the Nazi-Soviet pact was the most important cause of World War II, you start by discussing the Nazi-Soviet pact and how that led to the outbreak of war. So that's what you're doing for your first paragraph. The second paragraph is where you pick another event that might have led to, if the question is asking about reason for World War II, or in this particular case, as we're looking at the League of Nations, it might be looking at reasons for failure of the League. You try and find another reason, you talk about that and you link it back to why that led to the failure of the League of Nations. You then repeat again for paragraph 3, you find a separate thing to talk about, and in paragraph 4 you come to a conclusion. It's really important in the conclusion you actually address the question stem. How far do you agree with this statement? You need to make sure you're saying, I completely agree with the statement, I partially agree with the statement, I don't agree with the statement. You need to make that really clear. But what you also need to do is make sure that you've understood how your 3 paragraphs and how your 3 events are, or causes, whatever they are all completely interlinked. That's going to get you to the higher levels. I'm going to show you that in a second with an example. So the first example that we're going to have a look at is this one here. The League of Nations failed more often than it succeeded in the 1920s. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So as always, it's worth 16 marks with 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So just have a little think, maybe pause the video and think about, well, what would your paragraphs be on for this particular question? If I were going to answer this question, I would have my first paragraph based on those failures in the 1920s, because the question is saying the League of Nations failed more often than it succeeded in the 1920s. So it makes sense to look at 2 of those key failures from the 1920s. It gives you plenty to talk about as well in that first paragraph. So what you'd be doing is you'd be talking about the events in Vilna and the events in Corfu. Now, if you did the other question, the optional question on question 3, the one that was on the 1920s, you'll already be an expert on this and you'll be really well away with this first paragraph. So in my first main paragraph, I am giving a few examples, or 2 main examples, of where the League failed in the 1920s. So let's have a look at what I've written. The League's very first peacekeeping challenge in 1920 was not a success. So I'm already making sure that I am making reference, I've picked the wrong tool there, let me try that again. I'm making sure that I am making reference back to the question. This incident began with an argument about whether Vilna should be Lithuanian or Polish. So I'm making it clear that I've understood what the argument in Vilna was about. This was due to the new borders created after the war. So that's what it's all about. It's about how the country has changed. It was given to Lithuania, but the Polish army took control of it. So that's where we have this falling out. The League protested and then did nothing when the Poles refused to leave. So the League of Nations said that the army of Poland could not control Vilna and that they should leave. So they made that very clear. But Poland kept Vilna. This was not a good start for the League. So I'm already showing that I've understood what one of the failures of the 1920s was. Another failure in peacekeeping happened between Greece and Italy in 1923. Notice as well I'm using dates as well to show off my knowledge. A group of Italians were murdered whilst trying to solve a border dispute in Greece and Albania. The Italians were found by the League to be to blame, so the Italians were the ones who acted aggressively and hadn't done the right thing, but they persuaded the League to forced the Greeks to apologise and pay compensation to them. Or compensation them, as I've written there, to them. The Italians got away with invading another country and made the League look ridiculous. Therefore, the League did have a number of failures in the 1920s. So I'm making it clear that I'm not just writing a story, but I'm showing that the League of Nations was failing in the 1920s. So notice there's details about events, but also making it clear how the League had failed at that point in those two particular incidents. So in this particular question, our second paragraph would be, well, if the question is asking and saying that it failed more often than it succeeded, we need to have a look at what those successes were. So our second paragraph is going to be looking at 1920 successes. So what were these successes? That's what our second paragraph is going to be. Okay, so here's our model paragraph this time. They did have some peacekeeping successes in the 1920s. So again, making it clear that we've understood what the question's about. Poland and Germany quarrelled in 1921. So again, we're using the year, we're being specific, we're showing that we know which countries are having an argument. Both Germany and Poland wanted to rule Upper Silesia. It had a mixed population of Germans and Poles. This was an area that was quite difficult to decide. Should it be Polish or should it be German? The League organised a vote on who should control Upper Silesia. They then examined the results and divided the area fairly between the two nations. Both sides accepted the decision and worked with the League, a real success. So here, war was avoided between Poland and Germany because both of them saw that the League was working really hard and had organised a vote so it was fair, and therefore the result was accepted by both countries. Both got something out of it as well. Another success. Sweden and Finland were also involved in negotiations in 1921. Both countries wanted to own the Åland Islands. These islands were between the two nations, and they both felt that they had the better claim. The League looked at the situation and gave the islands to Finland. So they examined all the kind of historic evidence and they decided that Finland had a better claim. This was under the condition that the Finns kept the islands demilitarised. So the only reason they were allowed to keep it is if they kept it as not a threat to Sweden. All agreed to the decision and there was no further conflict. Therefore, the League did have notable successes at this time. So we saw in the first paragraph, yes, of course, it failed in those two incidents in Vilna and in Corfu, but then we've balanced out in paragraph number 2, where we've seen that they had a couple of successes with Upper Silesia and with the Åland Islands. So far then we've looked at both successes and failures in the area of conflict. So this is a bit more of a difficult question than you often get because it's like, well, what does our final paragraph have to be on, our final main paragraph? Well, it makes sense for me to look at other successes and failures that aren't involved in the world of peacekeeping. So just have a think for a moment before you move on to the next part of the PowerPoint, maybe pause it. What other successes did the League of Nations have? In your exercise book, you should have a load of different examples. So what I ended up focusing on was the other works of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, remember, one of its main aims was to improve the world through looking at living and working conditions. So let's have a look at what I said about both successes and failures in this area, again, focused on the 1920s. The League did do good work outside of peacekeeping, which was mainly successful. So again, I'm thinking about what the question's asking. So I'm not saying it's wholly successful, but I am making reference to the statement again. The League grew in size in the 1920s. So that's one success, it grew. In 1920 it had 42 members, by 1929 it had over 60, so growing membership. This was a sign of success. Germany was allowed to join in 1926, and this meant that it was seen as less of a winners' club. Improvements were made to people's working conditions. So, for example, lead was banned in paint by the International Labour Organization. That was poisonous. The League also repatriated or sent home 400,000 prisoners of war and helped Turkish refugees, closed down Swiss drug traders, and attacked Burmese slave owners. They also freed lots of slaves in Sierra Leone. These were all fine achievements and things which would may not have happened without the League. Finally, conferences were held in Washington in 1921, and countries USA, Japan, Britain, France agreed to limit their navies. However, nothing solid really came of these agreements. So although countries said, oh yeah, we will disarm, we will reduce our navies, no one actually did this. There was also a failure to get countries to agree to a 48-hour working week. That was one of the League's kind of promises that would limit how long people across the world had to work on an average week. Therefore, there were achievements and failures outside of the area of conflict. So again, I'm bringing it back to the question. So the last thing that you have to do in one of these question 4s is write a decent conclusion. In some of the other questions that we do, our conclusions are quite short. This one needs to be a little bit more detailed and needs to show that you considered all 3 of the paragraphs that you've written. So again, let's think about what the question is saying. The League of Nations failed more often than it succeeded in the 1920s. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So in this particular answer, what you've got to do is you've got to think, well, we've talked about those failures in places like Vilna and Corfu. We've talked about the successes in places like Upper Silesia and the Åland Islands. And we've looked at those successes and failures outside the world of peacekeeping. So did they fail more often than they succeeded? I want you to stop, pause the PowerPoint, and have a little think about what you think about that before we move on. Okay, so this is what I thought about it. In conclusion, in terms of peacekeeping, I would partially agree with the statement. So notice I'm straight away making sure I'm saying how far I agree. The failures in 1920 and 1923, so that's Vilna and Corfu, undermined and weakened the League as a peacekeeping body. These incidents outweighed the successes they had in places like Upper Silesia. So I'm saying, yeah, I understand there was both successes and failures, but I actually think that the failings were more important. Peacekeeping successes relied on the cooperation of those involved in disputes. However, the achievements in other areas are hard to avoid and make the statement false. The League made a difference to millions of people's lives. And meant there was a world body overseeing living and working conditions. It's the first time that this had ever happened. This was better than anything else set up at this time. So my conclusion in the end is, yeah, I kind of partially agree. I do think that in terms of peacekeeping, that their failures outweighed their successes. But actually, when we're talking about the League of Nations, we're not just talking about as a peacekeeping body. And therefore, my conclusion is that those other works that it undertook in the 1920s, actually, those successes were more important than all of those other failings. Okay, so we've got a second example of a question here. Britain and France were most responsible for the failure of the League. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. This is a really, really classic League of Nations question for a 16 marker. So the first paragraph needs to be about Britain and France because that's what's mentioned in the statement. So what should we include? So just pause this for a second and think about the responsibility that Britain and France had. Think about their actions and what you might write about in that first paragraph that would demonstrate that Britain and France were responsible for the failure of the League. You might have come up with Britain and France being selfish, and hopefully you came up with some really concrete examples of that, with things such as their actions in both Manchuria and in Abyssinia, and how from the very beginning they weren't really committed to the League. Let's have a look at what I've written here to highlight what I thought about the British and the French role. The lack of commitment from the British and the French was certainly a major reason. So again, what I'm doing here in the very first paragraph, the very beginning of that paragraph, is I'm making reference back to the statement. The lack of commitment from the British and the French was certainly a major reason for the failure of the League. Neither country was very encouraging from the start and believed that the League would fail. Neither country really had a lot of faith in the League of Nations from the very beginning. Neither Britain nor France were willing to lend the army to the League. However, the most obvious examples of the country's lack of commitment and self-interest can be seen in the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 to 1936. Both countries had armies in North and East Africa, so they both had the ability to physically stop them and could easily have militarily stopped Mussolini. They also jointly owned the Suez Canal. Had they blocked the canal, they would have made the invasion practically impossible. They certainly would have delayed the invasion. Britain and France preferred to give Mussolini what he wanted in order to gain him as an ally. This was important as they didn't want the Italians and Germans to form an alliance. This could be potentially dangerous for their own security, showing their selfishness. This meant they plotted behind the back of the League and negotiated the Hall-of-Al Pact. This involved giving Mussolini 2/3 of Abyssinia. It never happened, but the damage to the League had been done. It never recovered from this incident, a clear case of lack of commitment and self-interest damaging the League. So this one clearly shows that Britain and France were responsible, at least partially, for the failure of the League. So I said earlier, this is a classic kind of 16-mark question on the League of Nations, and that's because we're talking about the failure of the League of Nations. So once we've talked about how Britain and France were responsible for the failure of the League, you can look at other aspects of why the League failed. So an obvious one to write about would be about the membership of the League of Nations and how the membership led to failure. So what you're going to do is you're going to have a go at this paragraph. What I want you to do is I would like you to pause this once I finish talking in a moment, and I want you to write a paragraph just like the one that I've just written about Britain and France, about how the League of Nations failed because of membership. So consider who is not there. Consider about what impact that had on the League of Nations and why that led them to fail. So I've even given you a starter there for the beginning of your paragraph. However, the League also failed due to membership issues. So you might talk about the certain countries not being there. You might also link it back to the last paragraph and talk about the countries who were left to kind of take over the League of Nations. So give yourself around 8 minutes to have a go at this paragraph, making sure you're not just giving me information, but you're relating it back to the question as well. Off you go. Okay, so hopefully you found that last paragraph reasonably easy to write. Hopefully you used the information from the knowledge section from the other day and the notes that you'll have taken. So our next paragraph, again, it makes sense to look at another reason why the League of Nations failed. And of course, you could look at the behaviour of the countries. You might look at the behaviour of countries such as Italy and Japan. But a really obvious one to talk about when we're talking about what was responsible for the failure of the League, you could talk about the structure and organisation of the League of Nations and about how all of that undermined it from the start. So you might talk about things like the Assembly, the Council, you might talk about sanctions, you might talk about what the League didn't have and how all of that made it really, really difficult. And again, I've started you off with a sentence. A final reason why the League failed was because of the structure and organisation of the League. So again, 8 minutes, see how far you can get in that time. You should be able to write all about the problems with the structure and also link that back to how that led to the failure of the League of Nations. Okay, so you should have 2 good paragraphs now, one on membership and one on structure and organisation. So at the very end, you need to come to a conclusion. So before you start the conclusion, have a think. Do you think, out of all the things that you've written about, so you've written about membership, obviously you've got my model paragraph on Britain and France, and you've written about structure and organisation, make a decision. So it starts with, to conclude, I do or do not agree that Britain and France were most responsible for the failure of the League. And you might say, I partially agree. I don't agree. Again, you're thinking about that how far element of the question. So make sure that you're answering that and then explain it. Maybe again, just like we did in the last question, think about how you can link the different bits together. The reason perhaps that Britain and France were so responsible is because America weren't there, so you can link it to membership. One of the reasons perhaps why the structure and organisation and sanctions didn't work, again, might have all come down to membership and who was not actually there with the League of Nations. So for the conclusion, spend no more than 4 minutes writing this, please. And at the end of that, you'll have a super answer to revise from. This answer could also be done in several different ways. Now, I did it. Britain and France was the first paragraph, of course, because that was the one that was mentioned in the question stem. And then I talked about membership, and then I talked about the structure and organisation. You could have done it quite differently. After Britain and France, you might have decided, actually, I'm going to say that America was most responsible for the failure of the League because they set it up and never joined. You could, alternatively, as well, mention the roles of Italy, and Japan. They would also be perfectly valid and really good ways to answer this question. So rather than doing the structure that I followed today, you could have your first paragraph on Britain and France, your second on the responsibility of America, and the third on the responsibility of Italy and Japan. And if you're feeling like you really want to have a go at that, you could do an alternative version using those separate ways of answering it. Just like with the question 3s that we did last time, I've also popped in an optional extra. This is all about building up your ability to answer lots of different exam questions. It's also about trying to think about, us having lots of examples of your exam work. The more we have, the better. So this particular example, structural weaknesses in the League of Nations, when it was first set up, were the main reasons it was doomed to fail. So again, it's a classic kind of question about the League of Nations and why it failed. So maybe consider, what else would your paragraphs be on? So structural weaknesses, that's the structure and organisation of the League of Nations. What would your other paragraphs be on? You could have a go at that, making sure that you're referring to the bit about it being doomed to fail. So have a go at that. I've just realised at the end there it says explain your answer, explain your answer. I apologise for that typo there, or my mistake as I was writing this up. So have a go at that. Anything that you do, of course, feel free to send to your teacher, because we will mark any piece of work that you do. If you do have a go at this, you've got 24 minutes to answer it. That's exactly how you would do it. Rather than answering it as a full answer, you might decide that you would like to just do a plan. So I'm going to end again with a few reminders. So first thing, now, obviously at the beginning of the week, we were talking about a short answer test, and we're talking about how we're going to test that in lesson next week. Obviously, we're not going to do that now because we're not back in lesson next week. What I've done instead is I've set up a quiz on Show My Homework. So part of the first lesson on for next week will be you being quizzed on Show My Homework. That is a multiple choice quiz that I've put on there. Also, make sure you continue to make any other revision materials that you think you might need for learning the League of Nations, and attempt any of the optional questions that I popped on this week. So that was the third one yesterday and the third example today. Anything that you want marking, send via email or Show My Homework. Thanks ever so much for listening, and I'll see you again next week.